$1 trillion debt ceiling increase. A vote related to that motion is planned at noon Eastern Time. The House voted last week to block the increase. If the Senate also votes to block it, the measure would go to the President, who's likely to veto the measure. In that case, the House and Senate would have to come up with a two-thirds majority to override the veto. Senate would also vote on temporary tax extension of federal aviation programs. Fees and taxes, they run out at the end of the month. House and Senate negotiators say they're close to a long-term agreement. The House passed the short-term extension earlier this week. The House is not in session today. Democratic members are in Cambridge, Maryland for their annual Issues Conference. Live coverage of the Senate begins momentarily here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. Today's opening prayer will be offered by Reverend James E. Smith, Senior Pastor of the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Pioneer, Louisiana.
Let's pray. Our Almighty God says, if my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will they hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and will heal their land. Now my eyes shall be open and my ears attended unto the prayer that is made in this place. Lord, please grant our lawmakers the humility to know that complete consensus on most of the moral, religious, or political issues of these times is beyond their control. Only you, Almighty God, can move this body to seek your wise counsel and live to honor you above all else. As Apostle Paul says, endure to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, even as ye are called in one hope of your calling. May God bless America.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., January 26, 2012. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom Udall, a senator from the state of New Mexico, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
The guest chaplains, state of Louisiana, it's my understanding Senator Vitter would like to say a few words.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it's my true honor and distinct pleasure, joy, really, to help host Reverend Smith today. As the Senate chaplain said, Reverend James E. Smith is the senior pastor of Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Pioneer, Louisiana. He's from Rayville, Louisiana. All of this is in northeast Louisiana, the Monroe area. Reverend Smith is very distinguished and has brought real hope to so many people in so many communities in that area. First of all, as a spiritual leader, the leader of his congregation and so many others. Secondly, as a true leader in fighting truancy, fighting dropout rates very effectively, and also developing good jobs in the area through many school systems in the area. But the third point I really want to make, Mr. President, is I'm most joyful to help host him today because he is a true and a good and a tremendously supportive friend. And I know that from personal experience, from personal counsel and encouragement, and so do so many other Louisianians know that. And we cherish the Reverend in that very personal way. So I'm truly honored and delighted to be able to introduce the Senate to Reverend Smith. Majority Leader.
Following any leader remarks this morning, the Senate will begin consideration of the motion to proceed H.J. Res. 98, which is a joint resolution relating to the disapproval of the President's exercise of authority to increase the debt limit. The time until noon will be for debate on the motion to proceed and is equally divided between the two leaders or the designees. And I, at this time, designate whatever time that we have on this side to the Chairman of the Finance Committee, Senator Baucus. And at noon, we'll vote on that motion to proceed H.J. Res. 98. Mr. President, in 1946, President Harry Truman delivered his first State of the Union message. This was the first State of the Message since the end of World War II. The trials of war were behind us, but new challenges lay ahead. Truman laid out a vision for how America could not only survive those challenges, but thrive in the modern world. He described the path forward in simple words. He said, "Our basic objective, toward which all others lead, is to improve the welfare of the American people." That's what he said. That meant economic prosperity. It meant Social Security and unemployment insurance. It meant opportunity for higher education, access to medical care, and the dream of home ownership. The goal, he wrote, was, quote, that we become a well-housed people, a well-nourished people, an educated people, a people socially and economically secure, and alert and responsible. And in the 3 decades that followed that vision, that was reality. The middle class was never larger, never stronger, and it has never been easier to become part of that middle class. That's the way it was. Through hard work and ingenuity, Americans prospered together. For 3 decades after World War II, the rungs on the ladder to success grew closer together. But in the 3 decades that followed, something changed. The goal was the same, to be well-housed, well-educated, a nation of responsible and economically secure people. But for many, reaching that goal became very difficult, certainly more difficult. Income skyrocketed for the richest few, but they stalled for the rest, and the middle class lost more and more ground. Today, the richest 1% holds nearly half of all the wealth in this country. Today, the richest 1% takes home a quarter of all the wages, income, personal income. 1% takes 25% of that. And I repeat, the richest 1% holds nearly half of all the wealth of this country. Americans are working hard, just as hard as they worked 60 years ago. But that hard work is paying off for fewer and fewer people. What does that mean? For the last 3 decades, the rungs of the ladder to success have grown farther apart instead of closer together. And the farther apart these rungs grow, the fewer Americans climb that ladder. The farther apart those rungs are, the fewer Americans make it into a disappearing middle class. We just weathered the worst recession since the Great Depression. But the financial collapse of 2008 wasn't the cause of the problem. It was a symptom of the problem. It was a symptom of a system that's rigged to pay off for a few, but leave many behind. And it's time we even the playing field. As we rebuild our economy, let's rebuild it to last. Let's rebuild it to work for every American, regardless of the size of their bank account. This week, President Obama laid out a vision to do just that. The President's plan will spur manufacturing. It's time to reward companies that make it in America and end giveaways to companies that ship jobs overseas. It will reduce our reliance on expensive foreign oil. It's time to rely on plentiful, homegrown, renewable energy sources. In spite of the fact, Mr. President, that President Obama said that just less than 10 years ago we were importing 60% of the oil. Now it's less than 50%. We're producing more oil than we have in about a decade. That's good, but we need to make sure that the future is one of renewable energy. The plan will ensure today's students have the skills to become tomorrow's workers. That's the only way to keep pace in a competitive world economy. And it will return this country to the core values that has always made it a great country, a country of fairness. Everyone must share the prosperity as well as the responsibility. And every person and every corporation must play by the same rules. That value encouraged 3 decades of growth after World War II, and it can make America grow again. So I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make this vision of fairness a reality. Mr. President, I'm wondering, is the Republican leader coming down? Well, what we'll do here is Senator Baucus will be happy to give the floor to the Republican leader when he shows up. Oh, he's here? Okay, great. He's coming? Okay. So would the chair announce the business of the day? I would note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will...
Mr. Akaka.
And we are waiting for Minority Leader Mitch McConnell to make his way to the Senate floor to make his morning remarks. The senators now starting this debate on whether they will disapprove a $1.2 trillion debt ceiling increase. A vote related to that motion is planned just about noon Eastern. And you may have noted the House voted last week to block that increase. If the Senate also were to vote to block it, then the measure would go to the President, who's likely to veto it. In that case, the House and Senate would have to come up with a two-thirds majority to override the veto. Senators also voting later on a temporary extension of federal aviation programs, fees, and taxes. They will run out at the end of this month, and House and Senate negotiators say they're close to a long-term agreement. The House passed the short-term extension earlier this week. So we'll wait for Senator McConnell. We expect him shortly.
Mr. President,
The Republican leader,
I ask that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
without objection.
Mr. President, I want to discuss briefly a trip I took recently to a country that for much of the past 50 years is ranked among the world's most isolated and oppressed by its own government. Many of us wondered if things would ever change in Burma. But after my recent visit, I'm pleased to say that change is clearly in the air. It appears that Burma has made some progress toward democracy in the past 6 months, made more than it has in the last decades. As one who has taken a strong interest in Burma for over 20 years and is the lead author in this chamber of an annual sanctions bill aimed at encouraging the Burmese government to reform, I can tell you this is welcome news. On this trip, I had the opportunity and privilege to meet with a woman who, for over 2 decades, has embodied the struggle for peace in her oppressed country. After Aung San Suu Kyi's political party won 80% of the vote in a free and fair election back in 1990, the Burmese military regime dismissed the results and kept her under house arrest for the last 22 years, most of the time for the last 22 years confined at home. Scores of other political reformers during that period were jailed or tortured, and the regime waged a brutal campaign against ethnic minorities, driving many of them out of their homes and into refugee camps. But by her courage and her patience, that justice delayed would not be justice denied, Aung San Suu Kyi has kept the hope of freedom in her country alive. I've long admired her from afar. She once took a great risk to smuggle out Burma a letter thanking me for my support, a letter I have proudly kept to this day. But never did I think I would get to meet the Nobel laureate in person, and Mr. President, it was quite a moment. Following an election in 2010 that was widely thought to be unfree and unfair, the new civilian government in Burma, to the surprise of many of us, has made undeniably positive steps toward reform. In addition to releasing Suu Kyi from house arrest, scores of other political prisoners have been freed. During my visit last week, I spoke with 2 who had just been released days before my arrival. In one of the longest-standing armed conflicts in the world, the Burmese government's campaign against the ethnic minority called the Karen has apparently been brought to a close. Many Karen people who have fled Burma now call Kentucky home. I had the chance to meet with many of them and other refugees from Burma now resettled in Kentucky at Louisville's Crescent Hill Baptist Church this past Saturday. I enjoyed meeting with those folks and was pleased to relay to them the same message I share with my colleagues today, that change is indeed in the air in their country. Because of all these positive developments, I applaud Secretary Clinton's recent decision to exchange ambassadors with Burma for the first time in 20 years. Of course, the government of Burma still has a substantial way to go to achieve real and lasting reform. I would not support, and I don't think the administration would support, lifting the sanctions that have been imposed unless there is much further progress. The next test will be elections to fill 48 seats of the National Parliament on April 1st. Suu Kyi intends to run as the representative of a district with a significant Karen population. This election will give the new government an opportunity to hold the first free and fair elections in Burma since 1990, and also demonstrates the seriousness of its recent reform efforts. The government must also fully and peacefully reconcile with Burma's ethnic minorities. This is vital. Reports indicate that the military continues to engage in hostilities with the Kachin, and that is certainly troubling. And questions about Burma's relationship with North Korea must be answered. As the new government enacts reforms, we should respond with meaningful gestures of our own in the hopes of encouraging further positive developments from Burma's leaders. Reformers like new President Thein Sein, whom I also met on my trip, are strengthened when they can show positive results. Steps like exchanging ambassadors with the United States would enable them to do just that. So my trip to Burma has filled me with hope for its people hope that they will one day be free to elect their own leaders, and hope that every person, regardless of ethnic group, can enjoy equal rights and full protection under the rule of law. It also reaffirmed for me that the desire to be free is absolutely universal, and that the patient yet persistent leadership of one woman can make a tremendous difference. These are indeed exciting times for all who care about the future of the people of Burma. I know that includes a great many of my colleagues here in the Senate. Burma has quite a long way to go, but it is certainly moving in the right direction. Now, Mr. President, on another matter, a few weeks ago, President Obama asked Congress to raise the nation's debt ceiling. Today, virtually every Republican in the Senate will oppose that request. Washington needs to start spending less than it takes in, and our future will be uncertain and our economy in danger as long as the President fails to lead on this crucial issue. President Obama's record on the issue is absolutely clear. On the day he took office, the nation's debt stood at $10.6 trillion. Today, it's $15.2 trillion. More spending, more debt, fewer jobs. That's what we've gotten from this administration. And now they want to make it worse. Look, we should be working together to lower the debt, not having votes to increase it. But the President must be willing to face this crisis head on. He must be willing to acknowledge how serious this issue is. Most Americans understand that we can't keep spending money we don't have on programs we don't need. Unfortunately, the President doesn't seem to be one of those Americans. He's got no plan to get this crisis under control, and he continues to act as if it really just isn't a priority. Has he noticed how that's working out for Europe? Americans are worried, and they're frustrated. Middle-class families are doing without. Why can't Washington? Well, we believe it can. So today, Republicans will send a simple message to the White House: no more blank checks. Democrats have been in charge of the Senate and the White House for 3 years. They've had the time they need to figure this out. They've chosen the path of blame instead. They've had their chance. They've made it worse. We must do better. With that, Mr. President, I now move to proceed to H.J. Res. 98.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 294, H.J. Res. 98, joint resolution relating to the disapproval of the President's exercise of authority to increase the debt limit as submitted under Section 3101A of Title 31, United States Code on January 12, 2012.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the time until noon will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees for debate on the motion to proceed. Senator from Montana is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask consent the following staff of the Finance Committee be allowed in the Senate floor for the duration of the debate on the debt limit: Claire Green, Omar De Leon, Elizabeth Sampson, Amanda Summers, Johannes Echeverry, Whitney Lott, Samson Chen, Harun Dogo, David Sklar, Amanda Bartman.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Benjamin Franklin once said, "Promises may fit the friends, but non-performance will turn them into enemies." We should be clear about what the debt limit means and what it does not mean. Raising the debt limit does not authorize new spending. Let me make that clear. raising the debt limit does not authorize new spending. It does not mean an increase in future spending. What does it mean? It simply means that the United States will be able to meet its obligations. Increasing the debt limit only permits the Treasury Department to pay the bills we have already incurred. It does not authorize new spending. It says it permits the government to pay bills that have already been incurred. They've been incurred. We owe the obligation. It says, okay, we owe that. It's in the law. I passed. It's history. We've got to pay the bills. It allows our country to meet our promises to our citizens. And it means there are money to provide the benefits to millions of seniors and veterans and families that depend on them every day to make their ends meet. We should remember why we're taking today's vote. Last August, Congress enacted the Budget Control Act of 2011. We all remember it. This legislation reduced spending by $2.1 trillion. That was a budget action taken by the President and the Congress together that reduced federal spending by $2.1 trillion. It's a reduction. That's not commonly understood, not widely known, but that's a fact. And it provided a plan to raise the debt limit by the same amount. It did so that the federal government could meet its financial obligations so we could keep our promises. Today's vote would reverse that agreement in August. Voting to disapprove an increase in the financial limit is unusual. It would be very much like your bank increasing your line of credit unless you tell them not to. Nonetheless, that is the issue we are debating and voting on here in the Senate. Passing this resolution would mean there would be no money to keep our promises. The United States would default for the first time in its history. It would send a message to the world that the United States does not keep its promises. With all the uncertainty in the world, especially in Europe, that could have disastrous consequences. It could be a contagion. There could be a reaction, a spiral in the wrong direction, an interaction between the two. The United States defaulting on its debt, and in Europe, some countries defaulting on theirs, perhaps Greece. This is clearly the wrong time to take an action which would lead the United States to be placed into default. It would be disastrous consequences for our economy alone, irrespective of the repercussions, reverberations around the world, especially Europe. Our gross domestic product would shrink by as much as 1%, or more than $150 billion. Or we would be defaulting. That default would compromise our credit rating. What would happen if our credit rating is in jeopardy? It would cause interest rates to skyrocket. Just think what would happen, Mr. President, if the United States, as we're struggling to slowly get our economy going, would be faced with this big spike in interest rates. That would stop the recovery dead in its tracks. It would do more than that. It would plunge us probably back into recession. That's what would happen. Yearly prices for food, gas, and utilities would increase by hundreds of dollars for American citizens. Americans could lose thousands in retirement savings. That's if we default. The interest rates have to go up so much as a consequence of default. They have to go up so that investors would want to invest in the United States if we defaulted. U.S. businesses would not be able to meet payroll, much less expand. Millions of Americans would not be paid. Millions more lose their jobs. We're trying to get the unemployment rate down. This would cause it to go dramatically up. That is, default would cause it dramatically go up. If this resolution of disapproval passes, that would mean the United States would be in default, and that would mean jobs would be harder to find. Unemployment would rise. Americans would be unable to access credit to buy a home or a car, take out loans to attend college. The housing market would plummet again. The economy would fall into another recession or even a depression. At a time when our economy is starting to show signs of recovery, now is exactly the wrong time to risk a contraction. American workers, families, and small businesses can't afford it, to say the least. And if today's vote succeeds and causes a default, the federal government could not have funds to pay troop salaries. What about, let alone, SEAL Team 6 that took on Osama bin Laden? SEAL Team 6, we've read about in the last couple of days, that rescued Americans out of Somalia. There wouldn't be a SEAL Team 6, let alone all of other troops who would not be paid. Social Security benefits would not be paid. Just think of that. Medicare bills not paid. Think of that. These programs would all be in danger if we were to default. And a vote here would cause default. That is a positive vote. If we're voting to disapprove, the motion to disapprove should clearly not be granted. And that would hurt families and seniors who rely on, that is, these programs I just mentioned. We need to do all we can be doing clearly to help families make ends meet, not putting their jobs and paychecks in danger. There is no doubt that we need to work together in addition to reduce the deficit. Everybody agrees on that. How do you get the deficit reduced? By working together to get it done. We need clearly to make changes in revenue and spending sides of the budget. That's clear. We need to do so in a way that doesn't put jobs and our economic growth at risk, and we need to do it, obviously, in a fair and balanced way. That's why our people and our states sent us here. And as we do that, there have been many efforts to reduce the budget deficit, whether it's the Biden Deficit Commission, the so-called super committee, many budget proposals submitted or talked about. I'm talking about Bowles-Simpson and Rivlin-Domenici and so forth. And a lot of efforts. We're just getting closer and closer and keep working at it. We're finally going to get the job done. But as we work on that, we can't refuse to meet our country's obligations. That is, we have to make sure we pay the bills that we've already incurred. We need to show the world that the United States does keep its promises. We've got to show people that we live up to our word. So I urge my colleagues to keep our promises, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on the motion to proceed. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I would like to express my disapproval of the President's request of a debt limit increase of $1.2 trillion, which would place the total limit just below $16.4 trillion. The requested increase amounts to nearly $4,000 of additional debt for every American man and woman and child. And the total debt limit being requested works out to over $50,000 per person. Now, this would be a terrible burden to impose on our children. For many in Washington, including this President, this debt limit increase is just a matter-of-fact necessity, as we've just heard. Watching the mainstream media, many Americans might be surprised to even know that it was set to happen. But this is no small matter. This is not an inconsequential increase in federal spending. Federal spending is already out of control. We all know it. Our total debt is already greater than the size of our entire economy. I'm going to repeat that. Our total debt is greater than the size of our entire economy. And the debt ceiling increase being requested amounts to nearly 8% of our entire gross domestic product, or GDP, and the total debt limit being requested amounts to over 108% of GDP, which would place us in worse shape than many of the Eurozone countries currently confronting their devastating fiscal crisis, or this devastating fiscal crisis. Given the recent experience in Europe, it is disconcerting to hear repeated calls by the grow government at all costs crowd to double down on failed government initiatives to stimulate the economy by borrowing even more. Rates are cheap, they say, so let's continue riding this debt bubble as far as we can. Mr. President, we should have learned from the housing bubble and the European sovereign debt bubble that bubbles pop rapidly and with great devastation. It was not long ago that the grow government crowd was mocking concerns about indebtedness in the Eurozone, taunting what they called, quote, bond vigilantes, unquote, and saying that there was nothing there to see. Interest rates won't go up, don't worry. Rates are low, so borrow and spend. We know how this story ends. It was not long ago that we saw housing market participants lured by the promise of an ever bigger McMansion being told, "Don't worry, rates are low and house prices never fall, and the government backs your mortgage, so there is no risk." As outsized and highly speculative activity took place throughout the housing and financial sectors, federal regulators ignored all warnings, failed to use their existing authorities to promote safety and soundness, and frankly failed to do their jobs. To date, it is difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a single name of a regulator who lost a job. In fact, many in the top slots got promotions. Meanwhile, everything bad that exists in the housing market and in mortgage finance is blamed on the evils of private business. That's a great way to deflect regulatory failure, but a terrible way to get private activity back into the housing area and arena. The fact is, the housing bubble was caused by too much borrowing and the folks that egged it on. And the results were not pretty. Global investors struck against mortgage-backed securities issued in the United States, leading ultimately to a precipitous global strike on financial intermediation and massive government bailouts of financial institutions. The experience with the housing bubble caused by mortgage debt is being replicated with the explosion of sovereign debt. The bond vigilantes did strike against profligate Eurozone countries, and they precipitously demanded higher and higher interest rates to protect lenders from risks of default. This effectively shut entire countries out of the debt market. Entire countries face an inability to borrow at rates that they can sustain. Absent an ability to roll over debt, those countries have been forced to quickly and violently into fiscal restructuring, immediate austerity, and sometimes even partial default. The President's most recent request to take on more debt follows the same bubble pattern that we know will lead to devastation and losses. I, for one, do not wish for us to continue flirting with catastrophe by encouraging bubbles with the fool's gold that because rates are cheap, we should borrow more. We are on the edge of the cliff. It is time to carefully but deliberately take a few steps back. Rates may be low today, but they can turn on a dime. And when they do, the outsized federal government that we currently have will suddenly be exposed as unaffordable. And when that day comes, our creditors can go on strike as quickly as they have in Europe. Last summer, we got a taste of what it is to come when we received the first downgrade of U.S. sovereign debt in history from a major credit rating agency. Americans can never be allowed to forget that this downgrade occurred under and because of this administration's fiscal stewardship. We cannot risk what are likely to be further downgrades in the near future by raising the debt limit. Mr. President, it's time to resist the siren song of cheap credit and put our focus back on the job at hand, which is to allow the private sector to create jobs and get rid of the $1 trillion plus deficits of the Obama presidency, to get rid of our mountain of debt that surpasses the size of our entire economy, and to bring the size of our federal government back to its historical norms. Federal outlays as a share of our entire economy averaged 18.6% over the past 40 years. Under the current administration, federal outlays represent 25% of GDP in 2009, 23.8% in 2010, and were estimated to have been 25.3% in 2011. The current administration has engineered a federal government whose outlays represent 25%, 1/4 of our entire economy. The last time federal spending represented such a large share of our economy was back in 1946, as the world began rebuilding after the ravages of World War II. I guess this is what one of my colleagues meant when he said the other day that America is in good shape Economic and job growth remain weak, but Washington and government jobs it funds is doing just fine. The administration likes to talk about economic fairness, about the haves and the have-nots. But ultimately, the people in the best shape in this economy are those who owe their livelihoods to the federal government and federal taxpayers. When the 99% are being taxed to fund and fuel an ever-growing Washington bureaucracy, we have what the President might call economic justice. And there is no end in sight. After federal spending spiked in World War II, as the entire nation mobilized to defeat the Axis powers, it quickly ratcheted down, with federal spending averaging 16.5% of GDP in the 10 years that followed. Yet with President Obama, the ratchet only moves in one direction, and that is up. Equally of interest is the behavior of federal spending relative to the size of the economy in those Clinton years, which many look back on as the golden age of fiscal correctness. While Democrats focus solely on the existence of budgetary bliss, despite higher tax rates under Clinton, they typically fail to mention how the budgetary bliss was generated. It is difficult to deny the facts, and the facts include a reduction in federal outlays relative to GDP from 21.4% in 1993 to 18.2% by 2001, a 3.2 percentage point reduction. During those years, government receipts relative to GOP did rise from 17.5% to 19.5%, a 2.0 percentage point increase, but it is impossible to deny that the budget bliss was largely generated by reducing the share of the economy accounted for by federal spending. Of course, my friends on the other side of the aisle pledge allegiance to tax and spend economics. They wish to maintain a federal government whose spending amounts to 1/4 of the size of the entire economy. To them, federal spending and big government are not problems. They are virtues from which good things trickle down from government to preferred classes of people. They decry that a deep recession has caused government receipts as a share of GDP to fall below 15%, and argue in panic that the decline is proof that taxes must be raised, while refusing to acknowledge that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projects that revenues as a share of GDP will rise with economic recovery. Revenues as a share of GDP will rise with economic recovery. Federal revenues have averaged 18% of GDP over the past 40 years. They are projected by our Congressional Budget Office to reach nearly 19% of GDP in 2013, 21% in 2021, and 23% by 2035. Under current law, that's what they say. And I think that's crazy. That has never been the case in the past. Even under the CBO's so-called alternative fiscal scenario, CBO puts revenues as a share of GDP at around 18.4%, higher than the long-run average. Congress and the President should focus on the things that they are capable of controlling. Mr. President, federal revenues come from the economy. And as the economy recovers, CBO expects revenues to recover and rise above historical norms relative to the size of the economy. The President and his allies are putting the cart before the horse. They want to increase revenues by raising taxes. But the real way to increase revenues is to promote economic growth. Federal spending is something that Congress and the President have full control over, however. Every federal dollar spent counts because Congress and the President decide to spend it. Our deficits and debt are on an unsustainable path because of unsustainable spending. Yet with this debt limit increase, the President and his allies are confirming that they are comfortable with our government consuming an ever-increasing share of the economy. The President has made clear before that in the name of class warfare, he is comfortable raising taxes regardless of whether those tax hikes generate revenues or decrease deficits and debt. And with his latest proposal to tax the so-called rich, he has shown again that he is willing to ignore the fact, the clear fact, that we have a spending, not a revenue problem. To tackle our spending problem, unsustainable government promises embedded in entitlement programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security must be reformed. There is no budget analyst on this planet who does not identify entitlement reform as key to getting the federal budget back on track. Yet over the 3 years of the Obama presidency, there has been no plan. No plan from the administration to deal with entitlements. The entitlement can is simply being kicked down the road, and to deflect attention from our real fiscal challenges, my friends on the other side of the aisle resort to the politics of division. Tax the evil banks, and all will be equal, just and fair, they suggest. Tax millionaires and billionaires, no matter whether they are fat cats on yachts or small business owners, and all will be equal, just and fair, they suggest. This politics of division bears no fruit. It is an economic dead end, yet it is elevated to the top of the President's agenda to divert attention from our bloated federal government. The taxes on the so-called rich or on evil financial institutions or evil energy producers or evil insurance providers have been promoted in the interest of fairness and equality. Reducing income and wealth inequality is a laudable goal. Yet my friends on the other side of the aisle have not, and I repeat, have not proposed new tax measures to generate greater income equality through the tax code. The numerous permanent surtaxes on the so-called rich or on energy producers or on financial institutions have not been offered with corresponding permanent reductions in taxes for others with lesser means. Rather, they have been offered to promote more government spending and a permanently larger government. They are permanent tax hikes used to pay for temporary stimulus or taxes on business to fuel more spending or bailouts or government jobs. Of course, no mention is made of what effects those taxes have on businesses or private sector job creation. No mention is made about the effects those taxes have on the returns on retirement portfolios of seniors, which contain stocks and bonds of the vilified bankers and energy producers and insurance companies. The message to retired seniors in Sandy, Utah is clear. You've been suffering for years through near-zero returns on bonds because of Federal Reserve policy. But now you will just have to take it on the chin when the value of your pension falls because the federal government needs to tax business to get more revenue for union construction jobs or stimulus or for bailouts of mortgages of speculative housing investors. Mr. President, my friends on the other side of the aisle say they want more equality and more jobs, but do not offer tax proposals that would generate more equality through the tax code or a better environment for job creation. Instead, they want to tax the so-called rich to get money for things like high-paid infrastructure contractors while fighting tooth and nail on behalf of their union constituencies to retain and even expand Davis-Bacon and Contract Service Act coverage, which we know costs taxpayers money and stifles job creation. These types of schemes have nothing to do with equality. They have nothing to do with promoting as much job creation as possible. They have everything to do with the politics of division and with cronyism. I just chatted with one of the major contractors in this country who basically is out of business right now because banks aren't lending, can't borrow for projects. And that contractor said he's never going to go union again because it costs 25% to 30% more and the work is not as good. The workmanship is not as good. That's hard for me to believe because I was raised in the union movement. I learned a skilled trade as a young man. I worked in the building construction trade unions for 10 years. We were proud of the work we did. Of course, that was lath and plaster. I was a metal lather. That no longer exists. I remember fellow union members coming up to me and workers saying, "Hey, kids, slow down. We're not going to have any work if you keep working as fast and as hard as you do. Well, not only do they not have any work, those trades aren't in existence anymore except in very, very small specialties. A number of contractors have told me that they have to pay a lot more for union work that isn't any better than the non-union work. And yet we're stuck with Davis-Bacon that requires basically union pay in certain areas, and they broaden those areas way beyond the initial intentions of the bill. Now, these types of schemes have nothing to do with equality. They have nothing to do with promoting as much job creation as possible. They have everything to do with the politics of division and with cronyism. Now, I don't mean to stand here and demean my fellow union members, many of whom are really good artisans and really good skilled workers, but there's no question it costs a lot more. And there's a real question whether the work is any better than non-union work that costs a lot less. But we know who this administration wants to support. I look at this Indiana situation with the Super Bowl, and the union's threatening to shut down the Super Bowl. My gosh, how stupid can you be? If they do that, that'll irritate everybody in America. But nevertheless, they want the publicity that comes from shutting down the Super Bowl. Well, I hope my union members will think it through and realize that's not the way to do it. The best way to do it is to be better, to do better work, and to do it at less cost. Now, for instance, in the recent flurry of tax-the-rich surcharges offered by the other side, each corresponding spending idea has been clearly directed to appease Democrats' constituencies, mostly unions again, and to build up campaign season talking points that say the only thing standing in the way of Democrats' do-goodery is Republican refusal to tax some easily demonized group. Now, this might make for good politics, but it is no way to formulate fiscal policy, and it is no way to run a country. At first, to pay for a massive new stimulus plan of the president, the Democrats wanted to limit deductions for people earning $200,000 or more, which in September of last year was evidently how Democrats defined who is rich. Next came a proposed surtax of 5.6% on people earning $1 million or more to pay for the president's stimulus scheme. I am guessing that the earlier definition of rich at $200,000 did not sit too well or poll too well with Democrats in high-income jurisdictions in places like New York and California. Next came a surtax of 0.5% on those earners to give funds to states to help pay mostly union workers. Next came a surtax of 0.7% on those earners to help pay for a new Fannie and Freddie-like government-sponsored enterprise called the Infrastructure Bank. Next came a permanent surtax of 3.25% on those earners for what was billed as a temporary payroll tax preference, which ironically gives more to richer earners than it does to poorer earners and gives nothing at all to the unemployed. Next came a long-term surtax of 1.9% on richer earners, again for the allegedly temporary payroll tax preference. Mr. President, the pattern is clear. Democrats settle on their stimulus spending plan of the week, find out how much it will cost, and then find out what surtax to slap on high earners, including business income recipients. That is how we get tax proposals with rates of 5.6%, then 0.5%, then 0.7%, then 3.25%, then 1.9%. Who knows what's going to come next? Never mind that businesses across this country have been clear that massive uncertainty from the current administration's policies and proposals is holding back hiring, job creation, and the economy. It's holding back hiring, job creation, and the economy. Given the past few months of tax rate roulette being played by the Democrats, is it any wonder that families and businesses lack the confidence to take risks, make significant purchases, and grow the economy? And never mind that the Joint Committee on Taxation has told us that approximately 34% of flow-through business income, which tends to be small business income, would be subject to Democrat surtax proposals. But my friends on the other side of the aisle ask us not to mind the effects on job creators, even as the economy faces massive joblessness. If we abide by the recommendations of the editors at the New York Times, who are in lockstep with the Democratic Party, we should not care about more taxes on businesses. Indeed, in a December 9th editorial last year, those tax policy experts told us that. Quote, "For any savvy business owner, a surtax would have no bearing on hiring decisions. If new workers are profitable before tax, they will be profitable after tax, even if the employer has to pay slightly more of the profit in taxes," unquote. Now, this view perfectly encapsulates the understanding of the economy held by those who have never created a private sector job or worked to turn a profit. By the way, which includes most all of those in heavy positions at the White House. By this view, these rich business owners won't even flinch if you increase taxes. After tax profitability of hiring does not matter, evidently, especially when you view business earners as those evil rich. Mr. President, I know that in certain circles, it is fashionable to vilify business and hold the profit motive as the root cause of mega wealth. But the notion that business decisions, including hiring, will not be affected in the least by higher taxes is truly bizarre. The ongoing vilification of private businesses in America is shameful. Hardworking Americans who are by no definition rich, but who work in mortgage markets, in real estate markets, in securitization markets, in energy production markets, and in financial markets, have been hit with a blanket indictment from this administration that they are wrongdoers. Of course, if they do wrong, they need to go to jail. But my experience with the American people is that, by and large, they play by the rules, seek to offer useful products to their buyers, and look only for fair rewards for their efforts. They do not deserve to be vilified by the President and painted as purveyors of tricks and traps to abuse their neighbors in order to buy yachts. Again, anyone who breaks the law should go to jail. Any federal regulator who fails to do their job should be fired. But the vast majority of Americans who operate and work hard and honestly in businesses should not be shamed for their work. It would be far more appropriate to shame lawmakers who set trips and traps in the tax code in order to get more money for the federal government to spend, while falsely selling their schemes as paths toward equality. Mr. President, while President Obama seeks to take attention away from his historically record-high budget deficits and federal spending that accounts for 25% of the economy, and his jobs deficit, and his congressional relations deficit, by identifying some sort of, quote, trust deficit, unquote, that he has with financial institutions, it is imperative that he and Democrats in Congress do not spend the rest of this year playing election year politics. People need jobs, and the nation cannot afford to wait for the President and Democrats to get past November. We need to stop the tsunami of job-crushing regulations and the runaway regulatory agencies which continually stretch their authority in order to intervene into the economy and crush job creation. We need to reduce the time needed for private sector projects to clear the forest of regulatory and permitting red tape. We need to proceed immediately with known shovel-ready job-creating and environmentally safe projects like the Keystone Pipeline. Despite having cleared years of reviews and oversight, and despite support from virtually all interests, including unions, but excluding radical environmentalists, it is inconsistent for the President to say that he cares about American jobs while he prevents them from being created by approving the pipeline. While the President needs to approve the Keystone Pipeline, I wish to again express my disapproval of the administration's federal spending pipeline. Mr. President, the administration has lacked for 3 years, any serious and coherent budget plan. The administration has refused to deal seriously, if at all, with tackling unsustainable entitlement spending. It wishes to continue to practice the politics of division in order to permanently enshrine a European-sized federal government that absorbs over 1/4 of the entire size of our economy. Americans do not want this oversized government. Americans do not want or need job-stifling tax hikes. Americans do not need the federal government running their lives and making their choices. Allowing the debt limit to rise would only serve to promote things that Americans do not want and that Americans do not need. Therefore, Mr. President, I disapprove of the President's request for a $1.2 trillion increase in the debt limit, which would place the total limit at nearly $16.4 trillion, and I urge my colleagues to similarly disapprove. I suggest the absence.